The crystal halls of Viridia Prime had never seen such desperation. Ambassador Kelthra stood before the great assembly of 12 civilized species, her translucent skin flickering with patterns that showed her deep worry. The war against the void spawn had reached its darkest point, and every leader in the galaxy knew they were running out of time. Kelthra looked at the faces around her. The reptilian General Vorthok from the Saurian Empire sat with his clawed hands clenched tight. His people had been warriors for thousands of years, bred for combat and trained from birth to fight. Yet, even they had failed against these new enemies. The aquatic Admiral Leshen from the water worlds moved her gills in quick, nervous patterns. Her fleets had been among the first to encounter the void spawn, and she had watched entire battle groups disappear into the black emptiness that followed these creatures. "Honored delegates," Kelthra began, her voice carrying across the chamber through translation devices. "Our combined fleets have suffered losses beyond anything we have ever seen. The void spawn consume entire star systems, leaving nothing but empty space where worlds once existed. Our most advanced warriors, our greatest military minds, our most powerful weapons, all have failed us. The energy being called Luminos, who existed as pure thought and light, projected his concerns directly into the minds of everyone present. His mental voice was filled with an ancient sadness that made even the bravest warriors feel small. We have fought for 3 cycles now, and in that time we have lost more territory than in the previous 1,000 years of recorded history. These creatures are not just enemies, they are the opposite of everything we represent." General Vorthok slammed his massive fist on the crystal table, making the entire structure ring like a bell. "We have lost 17 core worlds in the past cycle alone. My people's warrior caste, bred for combat over 20,000 years, now retreat in terror from these things. They do not fight like any enemy we have ever faced. They feel no pain, show no mercy, and seem to exist only to destroy." In the back of the great chamber, almost forgotten among the towering figures of the galactic powers, sat a small figure in a primitive environmental suit. Captain Jake Morrison of the human exploration vessel Endeavour had been invited to this gathering as a courtesy. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel a few decades ago, and most of the galaxy still considered them barely more than an interesting curiosity. Morrison had been exploring the outer systems when the invitation came. His ship was small, his crew numbered only 12, and his weapons were nothing more than basic kinetic projectiles and primitive nuclear devices. Compared to the energy cannons and reality-warping weapons of the great powers, human technology seemed almost laughably simple. Admiral Leshen spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of terrible memories. "The void spawn are not just powerful, they are wrong in ways that break the mind. They exist in dimensions we cannot fully understand, and their very presence drives rational beings to madness. They corrupt our technology, turn our own weapons against us, and feed on the fear and despair they create." The ethereal sage Luminos continued the explanation, his mental voice touching every mind in the chamber. "They adapt to our tactics faster than we can develop new ones. Every strategy we employ, every weapon we create, every defensive measure we construct, they counter it within days. It is as if they exist specifically to destroy everything we have built." Morrison listened to all of this with growing interest. He had read the reports, studied the battle footage, and analyzed the tactical data. From his perspective as a human military officer, the galactic powers seemed to be approaching the problem all wrong. They fought with honor, followed rules of engagement, and retreated when casualties became too high. They valued the lives of their soldiers and the preservation of their civilizations above all else. "With respect, honored delegates," Morrison said, his voice crackling through his primitive translation device, "what exactly makes these void spawns so difficult to fight? I understand they are powerful, but every enemy has weaknesses." The chamber fell silent. The alien delegates looked at each other with expressions that ranged from surprise to something approaching pity. Finally, Admiral Leshen answered, her gills fluttering with anxiety. "Captain Morrison, they are pure malevolence given physical form. They feel no pain, know no fear, and fight with a savagery that breaks the spirit of any civilized warrior. They do not just want to defeat us, they want to unmake us, to erase us from existence itself. When our soldiers face them, they see their own deaths reflected in creatures that should not exist. Morrison nodded slowly, processing this information. And you need someone who can fight that kind of enemy. Someone who doesn't break when things get ugly. General Vorthak studied the small human with new interest. What are you suggesting, Captain? Morrison stood up, his environmental suit making him look even smaller next to the towering aliens around him. On my world, we have a saying, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. If these void spawn are as savage and merciless as you describe, then maybe you need soldiers who can match that savagery. Maybe you need warriors who are just as crazy as your enemies. The silence that followed was profound. The civilized species of the galaxy had spent millennia moving away from the brutal warfare of their primitive ancestors. They had developed codes of honor, rules of engagement, and sophisticated strategies that minimize casualties while maximizing efficiency. The idea of returning to savage, primitive combat was almost unthinkable. Luminos was the first to respond, his mental voice carefully neutral. Are you suggesting that humanity might be able to fight these creatures? Your species has barely mastered interstellar travel, and your weapons are centuries behind our own, Morrison smiled grimly. Sir, with respect, we've been fighting monsters our entire evolution. We call them different names, predators, enemies, nightmares, but the principle remains the same. When something tries to kill us, we kill it back. When something tries to destroy our homes, we make sure it regrets that decision. And when something threatens our families, we don't care about honor or rules or civilized behavior. We just make sure it dies. The delegates exchanged glances. The idea was desperate, almost insane. But they had tried everything else, and the void spawn continued to advance. Perhaps it was time to consider the unthinkable. What would humanity require to participate in this war? Kelthra asked quietly. Morrison thought for a moment. Access to your technology so we can upgrade our weapons and ships. Transport for our military forces and complete operational independence. If you want us to fight your monsters, you have to let us fight them our way. The chamber erupted in discussion. The idea of giving primitive humans access to advanced alien technology was dangerous. But as the debate continued, one fact remained clear. Every civilized approach to fighting the void spawn had failed. Perhaps it was time to try something uncivilized. 3 weeks after the meeting on Viridia Prime, the human colony ship New Horizon arrived at the crystal world carrying cargo that made the alien delegates nervous. 500 volunteers from Earth's military forces had answered the call for what their leaders had carefully described as an asymmetric warfare consultation. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Humanity had sent its warriors to fight a war that no civilized species could win. Colonel Lisa Hayes stepped off the transport first, her scarred face and cybernetic left arm telling the story of countless battles. Behind her came an army that looked nothing like the polished, uniformed forces of the galactic powers. These were soldiers, marines, special forces operatives, and mercenaries from every nation on Earth. They wore different uniforms, carried different weapons, and spoke different languages. But they all shared the same hungry look in their eyes. The alien observers watched in fascination and growing horror as the humans formed up in the docking bay. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the expedition's xenobiologist, studied the assembled galactic dignitaries with clinical interest. She was a small woman with intelligent eyes and hands that never stopped moving as she took notes on everything she saw. Fascinating, she murmured to Lieutenant Ben Carter, the unit's communications specialist. Look at their body language. They're terrified of us, and we haven't even done anything yet. Carter, a young man with the easy smile of someone who had seen too much combat, nodded as he adjusted his equipment. Ma'am, I think that's exactly why they called us. Sometimes the reputation is scarier than the reality. Zephyrian Ambassador Kelthra approached Colonel Hayes with obvious reluctance. Her translucent skin was flickering with patterns that the human translation devices interpreted as extreme caution mixed with desperate hope. She moved like someone approaching a dangerous animal that might either save her or eat her. "Colonel Hayes," Calthro began, her voice carefully modulated, "we must ask, are your people truly willing to face the void spawn? The psychic emanations from these creatures have driven entire fleets to madness. We have prepared mental shields and protective devices to guard your minds from their influence." Hayes smiled, and the expression was not reassuring. It was the smile of a predator who had just been offered an interesting challenge. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've been fighting monsters our entire evolution. We call them different names, demons, nightmares, enemy combatants, but the principle remains the same. As for the psychic protection, we'll pass. Our people have a saying, the only way out is through." Sergeant Danny Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 interstellar conflicts who had volunteered for this mission specifically because it sounded impossible, chuckled as he overheard the conversation. "Besides, ma'am, crazy is kind of our specialty. We've been doing it for so long, we've gotten pretty good at it." The alien delegates exchanged glances that their human observers had learned to interpret as a mixture of admiration and terror. General Vorthok, the massive reptilian warrior, studied the human soldiers with the eye of a professional. What he saw disturbed him more than he cared to admit. "These humans," he said quietly to Admiral Deschen, "they are not like us. Look at how they stand, how they move. They are not afraid of death? They are eager for it?" Deschen watched as a group of human soldiers laughed at something one of their comrades had said. The sound was wrong somehow, too harsh and too genuine at the same time. "They are barbarians," she whispered. "But perhaps that is exactly what we need." The first test of humanity's capabilities came sooner than anyone expected. A void-spawn scout vessel breached the system's outer defenses, its writhing black hull defying every law of physics and geometry that civilized science understood. The thing moved through space like a living nightmare, leaving trails of distorted reality in its wake. The Galactic Defense Fleet immediately retreated to minimum safe distance, following protocols that had been developed over centuries of warfare. The scout vessel was small by void spawn standards, but even a single ship of their construction had proven capable of destroying entire battle groups. "All human personnel to battle stations," Hayes announced over the communication system, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced impossible odds before. "Time to show our new friends what Earth's children are made of?" The human response was immediate and completely insane by galactic standards. Instead of retreating to a safe distance to analyze the threat and develop a coordinated response, the humans launched every available ship directly at the Void Spawn Scout. Their vessels were hastily retrofitted cargo ships and passenger transports, armed with primitive kinetic weapons and nuclear warheads that the galactic powers considered barely more advanced than throwing rocks. Captain Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Defiant, the lead human vessel, surrounded by his hand-picked crew. The ship had been a commercial freighter just weeks ago, but now it bristled with weapons that would have been considered war crimes by any civilized species. Mitchell was a former Earth Space Navy officer who had volunteered for this mission, because someone had told him it was probably suicide. "Remember, people," Mitchell announced to his crew, "we're not just fighting for humanity today. We're auditioning for the biggest job in the galaxy. Let's make sure they remember this performance." The Void Spawn vessel opened fire first, unleashing beams of pure entropy that aged metal to dust and reduced energy shields to whispers. The alien observers expected the human ships to retreat immediately, as any rational species would when faced with weapons that could unmake matter at the molecular level. Instead, the human fleet accelerated directly toward the enemy. Communications Officer Amy Johnson sat at her station, blood trickling from her nose as the psychic emanations from the Void Spawn ship washed over the human fleet. According to every scientific study conducted by the galactic powers, exposure to these mental attacks should have rendered the entire human crew catatonic within minutes. "Sir," Johnson reported, wiping blood from her face, "the psychic emanations are off the charts. The crew of any civilized species would be completely incapacitated by now." Mitchell wiped blood from his own eyes and grinned. The expression was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Good thing we're not civilized then. All hands prepare for ramming speed. The void spawn entity found itself facing something it had never encountered before in its existence. Every other species in the galaxy had responded to its presence with fear, retreat, or madness. But these humans seemed to grow more dangerous the closer they came to death. The human ships, engines screaming with overload, plowed directly into the alien vessel's center mass. The resulting explosion lit up the entire system like a newborn star, visible from the observation decks of the retreating galactic fleet. In the aftermath, as rescue ships moved in to recover the human survivors, the alien delegates gathered in stunned silence. The Void Spawn Scout, a creature that had single-handedly destroyed 3 full battle fleets, had been neutralized by a handful of primitive human vessels using nothing but brute force and complete disregard for their own survival. "They're insane," General Vorthok whispered, his reptilian features pale with shock. Dr. Vasquez, who had monitored the entire battle from the command ship, looked up from her instruments with the satisfied expression of a scientist who had just proven an important theory. "No, General, they're human." "There's a difference, but I understand the confusion." News of the human victory spread through the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours of the battle, communication networks across 12 star systems buzzed with reports that seemed impossible to believe. A single squadron of primitive human ships had destroyed a void spawn scout vessel using nothing but kinetic weapons and suicidal determination. The galactic powers had thrown their most advanced fleets at similar enemies and failed. Yet these newcomers had succeeded with technology that was barely more sophisticated than throwing rocks. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what this development meant for the war effort. Ambassador Kelthra stood before the assembled delegates, her translucent skin flickering with patterns that showed both hope and deep concern. The victory had been impressive, but the methods used to achieve it had been disturbing to every civilized observer. The tactical recordings show that the humans never attempted to retreat or establish defensive positions, she reported to the council. They accelerated directly toward the enemy vessel despite taking catastrophic damage. By all rational measures, their attack should have failed completely. General Vorthok studied the battle footage with the eye of a professional warrior. What he saw challenged everything he understood about combat. Their ships were destroyed in the attack, yet they continued fighting until the moment of impact. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is something else entirely. Admiral Veshin moved her gills in patterns that showed deep unease. The psychic emanations from that scout vessel should have rendered any crew incapable of coordinated action. We monitored the human communications during the battle. They were laughing while their ships fell apart around them. The ethereal sage Luminos projected his thoughts to the assembly, his mental voice carrying ancient wisdom mixed with new uncertainty. Perhaps we have been approaching this war incorrectly. We fight to preserve our civilizations, to protect our people, to maintain our way of life, but the void spawn exist only to destroy. They have no civilization to preserve, no people to protect, no way of life beyond consumption. We have been fighting an enemy that thinks differently than we do. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been invited to address the council about her observations of human behavior during the battle. She stood at the center of the great chamber, a small figure, surrounded by beings that towered over her, yet she showed no sign of intimidation. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice clear and confident, "you must understand that humans evolved differently than your species. We did not develop civilization despite our violent nature, we developed it because of it. For millions of years, we fought predators that were bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than we were. We survived by being more aggressive, more adaptable, and more willing to take risks than anything that tried to kill us." The alien delegates listened with growing fascination as Vasquez continued her explanation. "When you face the void spawn, you see enemies that violate your understanding of rational behavior. When we face them, we see familiar opponents. They are predators, and we are very experienced at killing predators." Colonel Hayes had been monitoring the council session from the Human Command Center. The political discussions were interesting, but she had more immediate concerns. Intelligence reports indicated that a full void spawn battle group was moving toward the industrial systems of the Crystalline Confederation. This would be the first real test of human capabilities against a major enemy force. Lieutenant Carter, she called to the communications officer, signal Earth Command. Tell them we need more ships and more people. This little demonstration was just the beginning. Carter nodded as he opened the quantum communication link to Earth. Ma'am, how many more people are we talking about? Hayes studied the tactical displays showing the approaching void spawn fleet. All of them, Lieutenant. Every volunteer we can get. Every ship we can retrofit. Every weapon we can build. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell and the survivors of the Defiant had been transferred to a medical facility on Viridia Prime. The alien doctors were amazed that any of the human crew had survived the ramming attack, but they were even more amazed by the humans' attitude toward their injuries. Captain, Dr. Zephylos, the chief medical officer, said through his translation, "Device, you suffered severe radiation poisoning, multiple fractures, and neural damage from psychic exposure. By all medical standards, you should be in critical condition. Yet you are asking when you can return to duty." Mitchell sat up in his medical bed, ignoring the pain that shot through his damaged body. "Doc, with respect, we didn't come here to lie around in comfortable beds. We came here to fight monsters. How soon can you get me back to my ship? Your ship was destroyed, Captain. It no longer exists." Mitchell grinned, the expression somehow both painful and determined. "Then get me a new one. I hear there's a war to fight." The medical staff exchanged glances that their human patients had learned to interpret as a mixture of admiration and deep concern. These humans seemed to view massive injuries and near-death experiences as minor inconveniences rather than serious medical emergencies. Sergeant Rodriguez, who occupied the bed next to Mitchell, laughed as he overheard the conversation. "Hey, Doc, you should have seen the last war we fought. This was just a warm-up exercise." The alien medical staff had no idea how to respond to this attitude. In their civilizations, soldiers who had survived such trauma would be given extended medical leave and psychological counseling. These humans seemed to consider it a normal part of their duties. Dr. Vasquez visited the medical facility to check on the survivors and gather more data about human psychological responses to combat. What she found confirmed her theories about why humanity might be uniquely suited for this war. "The void spawn use fear and despair as weapons," she explained to the medical staff. "They project psychic emanations that cause rational beings to lose hope and retreat. But humans have a different relationship with fear. We use it as fuel. The more afraid we are, the more dangerous we become." The head nurse, a crystalline being whose species had evolved from peaceful herbivores, found this concept difficult to understand. "But surely fear is a survival mechanism designed to prevent dangerous behavior." Vasquez shook her head. "Not for humans. For us, fear is a challenge. When something scares us, our first instinct is to attack it. We spent millions of years as persistence hunters, chasing down prey that was bigger and stronger than we were. We learned that the best way to deal with something dangerous is to kill it before it kills us." As the medical discussions continued, reports came in from across the galaxy. Human volunteers were arriving at recruitment centers on dozens of worlds. Former soldiers, current military personnel, mercenaries, and civilians with combat experience were all answering the call. The response was overwhelming the galactic transportation systems. General Vorthak reviewed the recruitment numbers with growing amazement. "These humans are volunteering for what is essentially a suicide mission, and they are competing with each other for the privilege. I have never seen anything like it." The truth was that humanity had found its calling in the galaxy. For the first time since achieving interstellar travel, they had discovered something they were uniquely good at. The civilized species needed monsters to fight their war, and humanity was ready to become those monsters. The stage was set for the real test of human capabilities. The Void Spawn battle group was approaching, and humanity would have to prove that their victory against a single scout vessel was not just luck, The Chronos system had been one of the most beautiful industrial centers in the galaxy before the Void Spawn arrived. 3 worlds covered in crystal cities and manufacturing facilities had produced starships for the Crystalline Confederation for over 1,000 years. Now those same worlds were being consumed by creatures that existed only to destroy. The Void Spawn fleet had arrived 2 days ago, and already the outer planets were beginning to disappear into the darkness that followed these entities wherever they went. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie watching the tactical displays that showed the enemy formation. The human fleet that surrounded her flagship was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. 50 ships that had been cargo vessels, passenger transports, and mining platforms just weeks ago were now bristling with weapons that would have given civilized military leaders nightmares. "Status report," Sullivan requested from her operations officer, Commander Nick Peterson, formerly of the Earth Space Navy, studied his instruments with the calm professionalism of someone who had spent his entire career preparing for impossible battles. "Ma'am, we have 3 battle groups in position. The Void Spawn fleet consists of 12 major vessels and approximately 40 smaller craft. By conventional standards, we are severely outnumbered." Sullivan nodded, her expression showing no concern about the odds they faced. "By conventional standards, Commander, we should have lost this war before we even arrived. Signal all ships. We attack in 5 minutes." The human fleet moved toward the Void Spawn formation with the same terrifying determination that had characterized their previous victory. But this time, the alien observers were watching something far more organized and deadly than a desperate suicide charge. The humans had spent the past month learning to integrate alien technology with their own brutal effectiveness. Colonel Sam Torres led the ground assault teams aboard the transport vessels that followed the main fleet. His special operations soldiers had been training for boarding actions against enemy vessels, something that no civilized species had attempted in centuries. The idea of fighting hand-to-hand combat in the corridors of enemy ships was considered barbaric by galactic standards. "Remember, people," Torres announced to his assembled troops, "these things feed on fear and despair. The more afraid they make us, the more dangerous we become. Use that. Make them regret the day they decided to mess with Earth's children." The soldiers under Torres' command represented the best of human military capability. They came from special forces units, elite marine battalions, and commando organizations from every nation on Earth. They had volunteered for this mission, specifically because it sounded impossible. Sergeant Maria Lopez checked her weapons one final time as the transport ship approached the largest Void Spawn vessel. The creature ship was 3 kilometers long and seemed to be made of living darkness that hurt to look at directly. Her squad had been assigned to board this monstrosity and fight their way to what intelligence believed was the command center. "Contact in 30 seconds, the pilot announced over the communication system. "Remember, once we dock, you're on your own until extraction." Lopez grinned as she turned to her squad. "You heard the man, boys. Just another day at the office. Try not to get killed until we finish the job." The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human fighters, piloted by men and women who had grown up on stories of kamikaze pilots and impossible victories, dove directly into the Void Spawn formation. Their ships were loaded with antimatter charges and nuclear warheads, but their most dangerous weapon was the complete willingness to die if it meant taking the enemy with them. Captain Alex Martinez led the fighter assault from his modified interceptor. The ship had been designed for planetary defense, but human engineers had stripped out everything except weapons and engines. It was a flying bomb with a human guidance system, and Martinez flew it like he was dancing with death itself. "All fighters, this is lead," Martinez announced over the combat frequency. "Target the big one in the center. If we can take down their command ship, the rest will be easier to handle." The Void Spawn responded to the human attack with weapons that should have been impossible. Beams of pure entropy aged human ships too. Dust, while psychic emanations that had driven entire alien fleets to madness washed over the attacking force. "The humans flew through it all," singing songs and telling jokes over their communication systems. Lieutenant Amy Johnson, now serving as communications officer aboard the Valkyrie, monitored the battle frequencies with growing amazement. "Ma'am, Fighter Squadron 3 just lost half their ships, and they're requesting permission to increase their attack tempo." Sullivan watched the tactical display as human fighters sacrificed themselves to clear a path for the boarding parties. "Permission granted. Signal all units. Maximum effort." The boarding actions began as transport ships rammed directly into the hulls of void spawn vessels. Human soldiers poured out of the breaches, fighting their way through corridors that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. The creatures they encountered were nightmares made flesh, but the humans treated them like any other enemy that needed to be killed. Colonel Torres fought his way through the command deck of the largest void spawn vessel, his soldiers moving with the precision of a team that had trained for exactly this kind of impossible mission. The creatures they faced were 3 meters tall and seemed to be made of living shadow, but they died when shot enough times. "Sergeant Lopez, status report," Torres called over his communication system as he ducked behind cover to reload his weapon. "Sir, we've reached what looks like the bridge," Lopez replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "These things don't like it when we get this close to their command center. They're getting desperate." "Good," Torres responded. "Desperate enemies make mistakes. Keep pushing forward." The human ground forces fought through the void spawn vessels with a combination of advanced alien technology and primitive human aggression. They used energy weapons alongside combat knives, deployed gravitational bombs next to hand grenades, and coordinated their attacks with tactical systems that their enemy could not. Understand, the void spawn had evolved to fight civilized enemies, who valued their own lives and retreated when faced with impossible odds. They had never encountered opponents who became more dangerous as the situation became more hopeless. The humans seemed to draw strength from desperation, turning every disadvantage into a weapon. "Command center secured," Torres announced as his team eliminated the last of the creatures defending the bridge. Beginning demolition procedures. The human victory at Kronos was complete and devastating. For the first time in the war, a full void spawn fleet had been destroyed rather than simply repelled. The method of victory sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Humans had boarded enemy vessels and fought hand-to-hand combat in the corridors of ships that existed partially outside normal space. As the surviving human forces regrouped, the galactic observers tried to comprehend what they had witnessed. The humans had not just won a battle, they had fundamentally changed the nature of the war. The void spawn, creatures that had seemed unstoppable, had been defeated by opponents who were willing to be more savage than the monsters themselves. Dr. Vasquez reviewed the battle recordings with growing excitement. The psychological impact of this victory cannot be overstated. For the first time, the void spawn have encountered an enemy that they cannot intimidate or break. They are learning to fear us, and fear is something they do not understand. The war was far from over, but humanity had proven that they were more than just desperate allies. They were apex predators who had found their perfect hunting ground among the stars. 2 years of war had changed everything. General Patricia Young stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the largest fleet in galactic history prepare for battle. 10,000 human ships floated in perfect formation alongside vessels from 12 alien species. The enemy waited at the edge of the galaxy in a massive structure that pulsed with dark energy. The Devourer Swarm had built their final fortress around a dying star. The Nexus looked like a twisted city made of living metal and organic matter. Spikes jutted out in all directions and strange lights flickered deep within its core. This was where the hive mind lived and controlled every Devourer creature in the galaxy. Patricia had fought in every major battle since the war began. She had watched good soldiers die and seen entire worlds consumed. Now she commanded forces. That would have been impossible to imagine when this all started. Human crews worked alongside alien engineers, and the ships themselves were marvels of combined technology. Commander Bobby Lee checked his weapon systems one last time. His destroyer squadron had been chosen for the most dangerous job in the assault. They would punch through the outer defenses while the main force engaged the Devourer fleet. His crew of 30 humans had trained for this moment for months. The alien ships moved with careful precision, but the human vessels darted through space like hunting predators. Years of combat had taught them to fight in ways that confused both their enemies and their allies. They struck fast and hard, then disappeared before return fire could find them. Captain Nancy Green suited up in her combat armor deep inside the transport ship. Her team of 20 elite soldiers would infiltrate the Nexus while the battle raged outside. They carried weapons that could cut through any known material and explosives powerful enough to crack a moon. Their mission was simple but nearly impossible. The hive mind had to die. Patricia gave the order to act, and 10,000 ships moved as one. The Devourer fleet came to meet them with vessels that shifted and changed shape as they flew. Some looked like massive insects, while others resembled twisted versions of normal starships. All of them bristled with weapons that could tear apart anything they hit. The first exchange of fire lit up the darkness between the stars. Human missiles streaked toward enemy targets while alien energy beams carved through space. Bobby Lee's squadron dove into the chaos and began their run toward the Nexus. 3 ships exploded around him, but he kept flying. Nancy Green felt her transport shake as it approached the target. The pilot was a young woman named Kelly, who had never flown in combat before this war. Now she could thread her ship through defensive fire that would have stopped veteran pilots from other species. Humans adapted to war faster than anyone expected. The Nexus loomed ahead like a dark mountain floating in space. Its surface crawled with defensive weapons and patrol craft. Nancy could see the landing zone where her team would begin their assault. Getting there alive would be the first challenge. Bobby Lee's destroyer took a direct hit that knocked out half his engines. His crew worked frantically to keep the ship flying while he continued the attack run. The Nexus defenses were stronger than anyone had predicted, but human stubbornness refused to accept defeat. 2 more destroyers exploded, but the survivors reached their target. Bobby Lee fired everything he had at the outer shell and watched massive holes appear in the structure. The way was clear for the infiltration team. Nancy Green's transport slammed into the Nexus docking bay with enough force to crack the hull. Her team poured out into an environment that seemed designed to drive intruders insane. The walls pulsed like living tissue, and the air tasted of metal and death. The corridors ahead twisted in directions that hurt to look at. Gravity shifted without warning, and the temperature changed from freezing to burning in seconds. Nancy had fought in many hostile environments, but nothing like this. The Nexus itself was alive, and it knew they were coming. Her team moved forward with weapons ready. Sergeant Mike Davis took point while Corporal Linda Wright watched their rear. They had trained together for months and knew each other's movements perfectly. Trust was everything in combat like this. The first Devourer defenders appeared from walls that suddenly opened. These creatures were different from anything the humans had faced before. They moved like liquid metal, but struck with the force of hammers. Their forms shifted constantly, and they seemed to absorb damage without slowing down. Nancy's team fought with brutal efficiency. They had learned to be creative with their weapons and savage in their tactics. Mike Davis used his plasma rifle to cut through 3 enemies, while Linda Wright threw grenades that exploded with alien fire. The creatures fell, but more kept coming. Outside the Nexus, the main battle raged on. Patricia Young watched her forces trade losses with the enemy fleet, but slowly gain ground. Human ships fought with a ferocity that amazed their alien allies. They rammed enemy vessels when their weapons failed and kept fighting even when their ships were crippled. The cost was terrible. Hundreds of human ships had been destroyed and thousands of crew members were dead. But the Devourer fleet was breaking apart under the relentless assault. Patricia felt no joy in the victory. War had taught her that winning often hurt as much as losing. Nancy Green's team reached the inner levels of the Nexus where the hive mind waited. The corridors here were filled with a strange energy that made their skin crawl. The walls showed images of consumed worlds and defeated species. This was the memory palace of a creature that had devoured galaxies. The final chamber opened before them like the mouth of some cosmic beast. Inside was a sphere of living darkness that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. This was the source of the Devourer Swarm's power, and the reason for 2 years of war. The hive mind spoke to them through their communication systems. Its voice was like the sound of dying stars, and its words carried the weight of eons. It told them about the cycles of creation and destruction that had shaped the universe. It spoke of species that had risen and fallen and galaxies that had been consumed. Nancy Green listened to the alien intelligence and felt something cold settle in her heart. The creature was right about many things. Humanity had become something different during this war. They were no longer the hopeful explorers who had first reached for the stars. They were predators now and efficient killers, but they were also still human. Nancy raised her weapon and fired at the sphere. The hive mind screamed as the energy beam struck its core. The sound echoed through subspace and reached every corner of the galaxy. For the first time in eons, the collective consciousness of the Devourer Swarm felt pain. Her team poured fire into the sphere while the structure around them began to collapse. The Nexus was dying and taking its creators with it. Nancy felt the deck shake under her feet as she pressed the trigger again and again. The sphere cracked and brilliant light poured out. The hive mind's voice grew weaker with each passing second. It spoke of cycles ending and new ones beginning. It warned that humanity would face the same choice that had destroyed other species. They could remain guardians or become devourers themselves. Nancy Green gave the only answer a human could give. She told the dying intelligence that humanity would choose its own path. They would not be bound by the mistakes of others or the fears of their allies. They were something new in the universe, and they would write their own story. The sphere shattered and the hive mind died. Across the galaxy, every devourer creature stopped moving as the intelligence that controlled them winked out of existence. The war was over and humanity had won, but victory came with a price that would echo through the stars for generations to come.